Welcome to another Text and Context video in our series on American literature. Here we are dealing with the early days of the American Republic, picking up after the Revolutionary War. A new political identity of America is formed, but as we're going to see and we're going to discuss here, perhaps not yet a literary, cultural identity as America, because we're going to see in this time period we are still largely dependent upon our European antecedents and our British tradition. The first group of writers and thinkers to deal with in the early days of the Republic would be a group called the Fireside Poets. It says here at the bottom of the picture, Washington Irving and his literary friends at Sunnyside. Sunnyside was the home of Washington Irving, whom we feature the Devil and Tom Walker in this chapter. And Washington Irving was a very important fiction writer, biographer, chronicler of his times, but probably more famous in his lifetime were a group of poets called the Fireside Poets, and these guys are actually all easy to remember fairly because they all have three names. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, probably the most famous of the day, William Cullen Bryant, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., John Greenleaf Whittier, and James Russell Lowell are usually thought of as the Fireside Poets. Quick note, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., to distinguish from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., poet, his son, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Supreme Court Justice. So quite a prominent family in American history. The three names really, I think, sound to the 21st century ear kind of pretentious, and that might not be an unfair way to characterize some of the writing you see of this. These were very studied guys. These were highly educated men, many of whom had successful careers in other professions aside from being poets. If there's a criticism levied against the Fireside Poets, it's probably that they were not the most original or the most inspiring. However, they were incredibly learned. They had a highly cultivated sense of language. They had a great sense of their audience and were widely popular. Another term for them is the schoolroom poets because they were so universally memorized by children in the day. A lot of these poems were these sort of longish narrative poems, a lot of times about American heroes. One of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's most famous is Paul Revere's Ride, and that was memorized by generations of school children. There's also this idea that what the Fireside Poets really did was bring that sort of poetry and that sort of performative aspect over from Europe. At the time, particularly in England, lyric poetry was the most dominant form. You have some wonderful, I guess you'd say, romantic and early Victorian English poets, mostly people like Lord Tennyson at the time writing. And the Fireside Poets bring that sort of popularity of poetry over on this side of the Atlantic, and many of them were more popular here than their British counterparts. They were essentially doing the same thing stylistically. There was an emphasis on classical forms. The subject matter was very similar. The performance and the delivery was very similar. So like I said, while maybe people would criticize the Fireside Poets today as not being the most original or creative in their work, they definitely established a literary tradition of poetry, and that tradition was very much in the genteel tradition. This idea that literature and poetry were cultivated arts. They were the domain of the upper classes, the educated elites. That's going to be challenged, and that's going to be changed in the second half of this century, in the later 1800s, by people like Walt Whitman, who make poetry and literature the domain of the working class, the middle class, the everyday. But at this time, literature is still a pursuit of the learned, and what we could think of as maybe the aristocratic Americans. So that's a fair way, I think, to categorize these men, and that shows you, sort of the evolution of an American sensibility, how it comes down from that height to being kind of an everyday pursuit. The other great name in this time period that we, of course, have to deal with is Edgar Allan Poe, and much of our chapter in the book deals with Poe's works, both poetic and fictional. Um, Poe is a very complex guy, and his career is very complex. He is a romantic, right? He is in that century of romances in the 1800s, and that is very evident in his work. There's a strong emphasis on emotion and intuition and psychology and the harder to define aspects of human nature. And I think that's apparent in all of his work. Romanticism is sweeping through Europe. Romanticism is affecting the literature of Western Europe, particularly Germany, France, Great Britain, Spain, and Poe brings that romantic spirit to the U.S. And that I think is seen in Poe's international success as well. That he's not just a successful American writer, but really is our first international literary superstar. Poe is a master of the short story. He thought of himself and defined himself more as a poet, but I think his short fiction is probably more widely read today. And he's thought of as the inventor of many forms. He invented detective fiction. In fact, his early detective stories inspired Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who went on to write Sherlock Holmes. He's thought of as the inventor of science fiction, and really was very innovative in a number of important ways. And in addition to his accomplishments in fiction and in poetry, was a respected magazine editor and critic, and wrote some very important literary essays, theories of short fiction, theories of poetry, and that's an important part of Poe's career. He too, like the Fireside Poets, had a lot of European influences. It's important to note that as a child, um, in his early school years, lived in England for about 5 or 6 years with his adopted family, um, and attended an academy in London, and had that sort of rigorous classical education in a European model. And that maybe accounts for some of Poe's international voice and why he was so popular. Many of his stories have a European setting or a European context, like The Pit and the Pendulum does. And Poe, like I said, is the first American writer who truly transcends this nation and is widely read the world over still to this day, translated into many languages, etc. So while there are great successes in American literature in this time period, we are still very much a cultural colony of Great Britain and of Western Europe, and we've yet to see that identity emerge, that uniquely American voice emerge, which we're going to see in the next generation and in our next chapter when we talk about sort of the dawn of the industrial age. So we look forward to that.